The rain hammered against the tall windows of the Wellington Performing Arts Academy that Tuesday morning.
Inside the grand audition hall, everything screamed money and prestige.
Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Polished marble floors reflected the dim lighting, and an enormous grand piano sat center stage like a throne. Director Richard Hayes sat behind a long mahogany table, scrolling through his phone with barely concealed boredom. He'd been running these auditions for 20 years, and honestly, they all blurred together anymore. Rich parents, expensive lessons, kids who could play perfectly but had no soul. Still, it paid well, and the Academy's reputation kept growing. His assistant Jennifer sat beside him, organizing folders with each student's application. She glanced at the clock. They'd already seen 15 kids that morning, and at least 20 more waited in the lobby. "Next one?" Richard asked without looking up. Jennifer picked up a thin folder. Very thin. Most applications came stuffed with certificates, recommendation letters from famous musicians, and photos from prestigious competitions. This one had maybe 3 pages total. Daniel Chen, 12 years old, from Queens. She paused, scanning the page. Training status says self-taught. Richard's head snapped up. Self-taught? Is this a joke? That's what it says here. He reached for the folder and flipped it open. No fancy music school listed. No private instructor with impressive credentials. The home address was in a neighborhood he knew well, the kind where people worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Under the section asking about performance experience, someone had written in careful handwriting, "Plays at community center events." Richard laughed. Actually laughed out loud. "Community center events," he read aloud so Jennifer could hear. "Well, that's definitely a first for Wellington Academy." Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. Should I tell them to reschedule? Maybe suggest they try somewhere else?" No. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, a smile playing on his lips. "Let's see what we've got here. This should be entertaining at least." He stood up and walked to the door leading to the waiting area. The moment he opened it, he could feel the difference. The lobby was full of nervous energy. Parents in expensive suits checking their watches. Kids in concert attire holding violin cases and sheet music folders that probably cost more than some people's rent. And then there was the boy. He sat in the corner with his mother. So quiet, Richard almost missed him. The kid wore a clean but faded blue shirt and jeans that were slightly too short, like he'd grown faster than his family could keep up with new clothes. His sneakers were old, the kind you saw at discount stores with the white rubber turning yellow. His mother was small and tired-looking, with hands that showed years of hard work. She wore her hair in a simple ponytail and kept glancing around the room like she didn't quite belong there, which Richard thought meanly she probably didn't. "Daniel Chen?" Richard called out. The boy stood up immediately. His mother squeezed his hand once before letting go. Richard noticed several other parents exchange glances, their expressions a mixture of confusion and barely hidden contempt. One woman actually pulled her daughter's hand away when Daniel walked past, as if poverty might be contagious. Daniel followed Richard into the audition hall, his footsteps quiet on the marble floor. Jennifer gave him an encouraging smile, but the boy's face remained calm and unreadable. "So, Daniel," Richard said, settling back into his chair, "I see here you're self-taught. No formal training at all?" "My grandmother taught me, sir." "Your grandmother?" Richard nodded slowly, exchanging a look with Jennifer. "And is your grandmother a professional pianist?" "She was in China, but she had to stop when she came here. She worked in a factory instead." "Right. Of course." Richard tapped his pen against the table. "And you've been playing how long?" "Since I was 5. 7 years now." "7 years on, what, a keyboard at home?" "Yes, sir." Richard stood up and walked over to the corner of the room where an old upright piano sat. It was a decent instrument, well maintained, but nothing like the concert grand they used for serious auditions. That beautiful Steinway was reserved for students who actually had a chance. "Tell you what, Daniel," Richard said loudly enough that Jennifer and the few staff members in the room could hear. "Why don't you play something for us on this piano here? Nothing too complicated. Maybe a simple piece, something at your level." Daniel walked over to the piano without a word. He adjusted the bench height, his movements careful and precise. Richard turned to Jennifer and the other staff members, making sure his voice carried. "You know what? I'm feeling generous today. I'll make a deal right here, right now." He paused for effect. If this kid can actually play that piano, I mean really play it with genuine skill and not just bang out some basic tune, I'll kneel down right here in front of everyone." The room went quiet for a second before someone let out a nervous laugh. Jennifer's eyes went wide. "Richard, maybe we should just—" No, I'm serious." He was grinning now, enjoying himself. "If young Daniel here shows me real talent, professional level playing, I will get down on one knee right here on this floor. I promise." He said it loud enough that the door to the waiting area was slightly open, and several parents had gathered there, curious about the commotion. They could all hear him clearly. Daniel's mother stood in the doorway now, her face pale but her jaw set. She didn't say anything, didn't defend her son or argue with the director. She just watched, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Richard folded his arms across his chest and leaned against the wall, still smiling. This was the most interesting thing that had happened all week. The other auditions had been so predictable, so boring. At least this would be memorable. Something to laugh about later over drinks with his colleagues. Daniel sat at the piano bench, his back straight, his hands resting gently on his lap for a moment. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look scared or intimidated. He just looked focused. The rain continued to fall outside, drumming against the windows in a steady rhythm. Inside the audition hall, everyone waited. The staff members had stopped pretending to work and were watching openly now. The parents in the doorway craned their necks to see better. Richard checked his watch, his smile still in place. "Whenever you're ready, son. Take your time. No pressure." But there was pressure, of course. All the pressure in the world. The expensive academy, the mocking director, the skeptical audience, the mother watching from the doorway with her heart in her throat. Daniel closed his eyes for just a moment. His fingers flexed slightly, then settled onto the keys. And then in that moment, before the first note sounded, something changed in the room. Maybe it was the way the boy's shoulders relaxed, or the way his breathing steadied, or something else entirely. But suddenly Richard's smile faltered just a little. The boy's hands moved to position, hovering over the keys. The room held its breath and Daniel began to play. The first notes came out soft and gentle, almost like a whisper. Daniel's fingers touched the keys with such delicacy that Richard had to lean forward slightly to hear. For a split second he felt his confidence return. See? Just a basic beginner's piece, probably something the grandmother taught him from an old songbook. But then something shifted. The melody began to unfold, and Richard's trained ear caught it immediately. This wasn't some simple children's song. This was Chopin. Not just any Chopin either, but the Ballad No. 1 in G minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the entire classical piano repertoire. Richard's smile vanished completely. Jennifer's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the table, but no one noticed. Her mouth had fallen open slightly, her eyes fixed on the small boy at the piano. Daniel's hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence, building the opening theme with careful precision. The old upright piano, which Richard had dismissed as adequate for practice but nothing special, suddenly seemed to come alive under the boy's touch. Each note rang out clear and pure. "That's impossible," Richard whispered, but his voice was drowned out by the music. The parents who had been standing in the doorway were now pushing further into the room, drawn by what they were hearing. One father, who had been checking his phone just moments ago, held it limply at his side, forgotten. A mother who had earlier pulled her daughter away from Daniel now stood frozen, her hand over her heart. Daniel's mother remained in the doorway, tears already streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of embarrassment or shame anymore. Her expression had transformed into something fierce and proud, mixed with a grief that Richard couldn't quite understand yet. The music grew more complex. Daniel's small hand stretched across the keys, reaching intervals that should have been impossible for someone his size. But he made it look effortless, natural, like his fingers knew exactly where to go without conscious thought. Richard found himself sinking slowly into his chair. He'd heard this piece performed hundreds of times. He'd sat through concerts at Carnegie Hall, at the Kennedy Center, at music festivals across Europe. Professional pianists with decades of training had played this piece for him. Some had done it well, some had done it beautifully, but this was different. This wasn't just technical skill, though the technique was flawless. This wasn't just memorization, though the boy clearly knew every note by heart. This was something else entirely. Something that couldn't be taught in any academy, no matter how prestigious or expensive. The boy was telling a story with the music. Jennifer felt it too. She'd stopped trying to take notes entirely, her notepad forgotten on the table. Her eyes were glistening. Beside her, the academy's music coordinator, an elderly man named Vincent who'd been teaching for 40 years, had removed his glasses and was wiping them slowly, though Richard suspected it wasn't the lenses that needed clearing. The piece moved into its dramatic middle section, where the tempo increased and the technical demands became brutal, thundering octaves in the left hand, racing passages in the right, both hands working together in a coordination that took most pianists years to master. Daniel's face remained calm and focused, but his whole body moved with the music now, not in some theatrical way, not showing off or performing for the audience. It was natural, unconscious, like the music was flowing through him and he had to move with it or burst. The rain outside seemed to match the intensity of the performance, hammering harder against the windows as Daniel reached the piece's most powerful moments. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the room in stark white light, but no one flinched or looked away from the piano. Richard's mind was racing. Where had this come from? 7 years of training, the boy had said. 7 years learning from a grandmother who had been a pianist in China before immigrating and working in a factory. It didn't make sense. This level of skill required private tutors, master classes, hours of daily practice with professional guidance. But even as he thought it, Richard knew he was wrong. He was watching the proof that everything he'd believed about teaching music, about what it took to create a real musician, might be incomplete. This boy had learned from love and dedication, from a grandmother who must have poured her own lost dreams into her grandson's education. The audience in the room had grown. Staff members from other parts of the building had heard the music and wandered over. A janitor stood in the back corner, his mop forgotten, completely absorbed. The security guard who usually stayed at the front desk was now visible through the doorway, straining to hear every note. One of the waiting students, a girl about Daniel's age who had been scheduled to audition after him, stood next to her father with tears running down her cheeks. She clutched her violin case to her chest like a shield, and Richard could see in her face that she understood she was witnessing something she might never experience again. The music softened for a moment, becoming almost fragile. This was the part of the piece where many pianists struggled to maintain the emotional connection, where the technical perfection could become cold and mechanical. But Daniel played it with such tenderness that it felt like a conversation, like someone sharing a precious memory that might break if handled too roughly. Richard thought of his own childhood. Learning piano at an expensive conservatory in Boston, his teacher had been strict, focused on precision and technique. He'd learned to play correctly, to hit every note at the right time with the right pressure. He'd won competitions and earned scholarships and eventually built a successful career. But had he ever played like this? Had he ever felt the music the way this 12-year-old boy from Queens clearly felt it? The answer, painful as it was to admit even in the privacy of his own thoughts, was no. The piece was building toward its conclusion now. The final section of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 was a test of endurance, both physical and emotional. The rapid passages came faster. The dynamics swung from whisper quiet to thunderously loud, and the pianist's hands had to cover the entire range of the keyboard in sweeping movements. Daniel's small frame seemed to grow larger somehow, rising slightly from the bench as he poured everything into these final moments. Sweat had formed on his forehead and his breath came faster, but his fingers never faltered. Not once. Not a single missed note. Not a single hesitation. The old upright piano, which Richard had always thought of as adequate but unremarkable, sang out with a richness and depth that seemed impossible. Or maybe it had always been capable of this sound, and it just took the right person to find it. The music swelled to its final climax. Daniel's hands came crashing down on the keys in the piece's powerful ending, the sound filling every corner of the audition hall and spilling out into the corridors beyond. And then, with one last gentle phrase, it was over. The final chord hung in the air, resonating through the strings of the piano, gradually fading into silence. Daniel lifted his hands from the keys slowly, carefully, as if saying goodbye to something precious. He opened his eyes and sat very still on the bench, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched out for 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Jennifer had covered her mouth with both hands and tears were running freely down her face now. Vincent, the elderly music coordinator, had his eyes closed, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer, or simply words he couldn't find the voice to say aloud. In the doorway, Daniel's mother had sunk to her knees, her hands pressed together in front of her face. She was crying silently, her shoulders shaking. The rain had stopped. When exactly, nobody could say. But the windows were now silent, water dripping slowly down the glass like the room itself was weeping. Daniel turned slightly on the bench, looking back at Richard. The boy's expression was calm, patient, not triumphant or smug, just waiting. And then everyone in that room remembered the promise, the bold, mocking declaration that had been made just minutes ago. Though it felt like a lifetime had passed, the silence in the room was suffocating. Richard could feel every pair of eyes on him, waiting, watching. His heart pounded in his chest so hard he was sure people could hear it. The confident smile he'd worn just 15 minutes ago felt like it belonged to a different person entirely. Jennifer touched his arm gently. "Richard," she whispered so quietly only he could hear, but she didn't need to say more. He knew exactly what she meant. He'd made a promise. In front of everyone, loudly and mockingly, with complete certainty that he'd never have to follow through. And now dozens of people stood as witnesses to those words, including parents who paid enormous tuition fees and staff members who worked under his direction. Richard's legs felt weak as he pushed himself up from his chair. The leather creaked softly, unnaturally loud in the silent room. He could feel his face burning, heat creeping up his neck and spreading across his cheeks. Daniel remained at the piano bench, his small hands now resting in his lap. He wasn't smiling or gloating. He just looked tired, like the performance had taken everything out of him. His eyes met Richard's and there was no judgment there. Just a quiet patience that somehow made everything worse. The walk from the table to the piano felt impossibly long. Richard's expensive Italian shoes clicked against the marble floor with each step. Click, click, click. Each sound echoed through the hall like a countdown. He could see the faces watching him. Vincent, the old music coordinator, had tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Jennifer was biting her lip, her eyes red. The parents in the doorway stood frozen, some with their phones out now, recording. Of course they were recording. This moment would be all over social media within the hour. When Richard reached the piano, he stopped. He stood there for a long moment looking down at Daniel. The boy had to tilt his head back to meet his gaze. "Where?" Richard's voice came out rough and broken. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "My grandmother taught me," Daniel said simply. "Every day after school for 7 years. She said music wasn't about expensive pianos or fancy schools. She said it was about listening with your heart and practicing with your hands until the two became one." Richard felt something crack inside his chest. He thought about his own education, the thousands of dollars his parents had spent, the prestigious teachers, the competitions, the pressure to be perfect. And here was this child who had learned everything that mattered from an immigrant grandmother in a small apartment in Queens. What piece was that? One of the parents in the doorway asked, though several others shushed them immediately. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," Vincent answered, his voice shaking. "It's considered one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. Professional concert pianists prepare for months before attempting it in public." The parents' eyes widened. They looked at Daniel with new understanding, then back at Richard, waiting. Richard's knees felt like they might give out. His pride, his reputation, his carefully constructed image of authority, all of it seemed to dissolve in the face of what he'd just witnessed. And what he'd promised to do. He took a deep breath. Then slowly, deliberately, Richard Hayes lowered himself down onto one knee in front of Daniel Chen. The sound of his knee hitting the polished marble floor echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Several people gasped. One parent actually stumbled backward. Jennifer pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes squeezed shut. In the doorway, Daniel's mother let out a sob that she quickly tried to muffle. But Richard heard it, and when he glanced over, he saw she'd covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook with silent crying. Richard looked up at Daniel from his position on the floor. The boy seemed embarrassed now, uncomfortable with the attention, with the drama of the moment. He shifted on the piano bench, not sure where to look. "I was wrong," Richard said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I have been directing auditions at this academy for 20 years. I've heard thousands of students play, professional musicians, child prodigies, students who went on to perform at the world's greatest concert halls." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I have never, in all those years, heard anything like what you just played, never." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Richard continued, still kneeling. "I judged you the moment you walked through that door. I looked at your clothes, at where you came from, at the fact that you were self-taught, and I decided you couldn't possibly have real talent. I made a joke at your expense because I was so certain I was right." The shame in his voice was palpable. Some of the parents who had earlier shared his dismissive attitude now looked at the floor, suddenly very interested in their shoes. "But you just taught me something that none of my expensive teachers ever could," Richard said. "You taught me that music doesn't care about money or status or prestigious schools. Real talent, real dedication, real love for music that comes from somewhere deeper. And your grandmother clearly understood that in a way that I forgot." Vincent had moved closer now, standing just a few feet away. "The boy's technique is flawless," he said, his old voice trembling with emotion. "But more than that, he understands the music. He doesn't just play the notes. He feels them, lives them. You can't teach that in any classroom." Richard nodded, still on one knee. His leg was starting to ache, but he didn't move. This moment needed to happen, needed to be witnessed and remembered. "Is your grandmother here today?" Richard asked Daniel gently. The boy's face changed, a shadow of pain crossing his features. He shook his head slowly. "She passed away 2 years ago. Cancer." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He understood now, suddenly and completely, why the music had carried such deep emotion. Daniel wasn't just playing a difficult piece to impress an academy director. He was playing for his grandmother. Every note was a conversation with someone he'd lost, a connection maintained through the one thing she'd given him that could never be taken away. "She would be so proud of you," Richard said, and his voice broke on the last word. Daniel's eyes filled with tears for the first time. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Richard finally pushed himself up from the floor, his knees protesting. He stood and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You don't need this academy," he said honestly. "Your grandmother already gave you everything that matters. But if you want to study here, if you want access to better instruments and additional training, I would be honored to have you as a student." "Really?" Daniel's voice was small, almost disbelieving. "Really?" Richard looked over at Jennifer. "Full scholarship. And I want him working with Vincent twice a week for private instruction." Vincent beamed through his tears. "It would be my privilege." The parents in the doorway had started whispering to each other now, the spell of silence finally broken. Phones were definitely out, recording everything. Richard knew this moment would follow him for the rest of his career, but strangely he found he didn't mind. Some lessons needed to be learned publicly. Some moments of humility needed witnesses. Daniel's mother had entered the room fully now, moving toward her son on unsteady legs. When she reached the piano, Daniel stood up and she pulled him into a tight embrace, whispering something in his ear that no one else could hear. Richard stepped back, giving them space. He caught Jennifer's eye and saw something new in her expression. Respect, maybe, or perhaps just relief that he'd done the right thing. The other students waiting for their auditions had crowded into the doorway now, their own nerves forgotten in the wake of what they'd witnessed. One boy, who was scheduled to play violin, looked at his instrument case with newfound doubt. How could anyone follow that performance? But Richard's mind was already moving forward, thinking about changes that needed to be made. The scholarship program that had always favored students from wealthy families with impressive resumes. The audition process that gave advantages to those who could afford the best teachers. The whole system that had led him to almost dismiss genuine genius because it arrived in worn sneakers and a faded shirt. Daniel and his mother finally separated, though she kept one hand on his shoulder. She looked at Richard, and he saw in her face a complex mixture of gratitude and lingering hurt. The hurt of having watched her son be mocked even though it had ended in triumph. "Mrs. Chen," Richard said, "I owe you and your son an apology. A real one, not just a public gesture. What I did was wrong and there's no excuse for it." She studied his face for a long moment, then gave a small nod. My mother-in-law used to say that the best teachers are the ones who never stop learning themselves. Maybe today you learned something important. Her words were kind, far kinder than he deserved, and they hit harder than any angry accusation could have. Maybe I did. Richard agreed quietly. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. Light streamed through the tall windows, casting long golden rays across the piano where Daniel had just performed. The droplets of rain on the glass caught the light and sparkled like diamonds. Richard looked around the room at all the faces, staff and parents and students, all of them forever changed by what they'd witnessed. He thought about the story that would spread from this moment, the videos that would be shared, the conversations that would happen, and he realized that sometimes the most important performances weren't about the music at all. They were about what the music revealed in the people listening. The video went viral within 3 hours. Someone in the audition room, Richard never found out who, had recorded the entire performance on their phone. By lunchtime, it was spreading across social media like wildfire. By evening, it had been viewed over 2 million times. By the next morning, news outlets were calling the Academy requesting interviews. Richard sat in his office that Wednesday afternoon, watching his phone light up with notifications. The video had been shared by famous musicians, music teachers, even celebrities who had nothing to do with classical music. Everyone wanted to talk about the boy from Queens who played Chopin like a master, and the arrogant director who had to eat his words. The comments section was brutal. Thousands of people calling him out for his prejudice, his mockery, his assumptions. But there were other comments too, ones that surprised him. People praising him for keeping his word, for showing genuine remorse, for offering the scholarship. Some even said they respected him more for admitting he was wrong than if he'd been right all along. Jennifer knocked on his open door. "The board wants to meet with you. Tomorrow morning, 9 sharp." Richard nodded slowly. He'd expected this. The board of directors didn't appreciate viral videos, especially ones that made the Academy look bad. Even if the ending was positive, the beginning had been a disaster. "How bad is it?" he asked. Jennifer came in and sat down across from his desk. "Honestly, it could go either way. Half the board is furious about the negative attention. The other half is thrilled, because applications have tripled since yesterday. Parents from all over the country are suddenly interested in Wellington Academy. Because they think we'll give their kids scholarships now, some of them. Others because they saw what real teaching should look like. Vincent's private lesson slots are completely booked for the next 6 months. Everyone wants their child to study with the man who mentored Daniel." Richard rubbed his face tiredly. "Vincent didn't mentor him. His grandmother did. I know that. You know that." "But that's the narrative now." Jennifer leaned forward. "Richard, I've worked with you for 8 years. I've never seen you like you were yesterday. What changed?" He was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer. "I heard something real," he finally said. "Not just technically perfect, not just well-rehearsed. That boy played like his life depended on it. Like the music was the only thing keeping him connected to someone he lost. And I realized that in 20 years of running auditions, I'd been looking for the wrong things." Jennifer nodded. "So what are you going to do about it?" That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Daniel's face when he'd mentioned his grandmother. The way the boy's eyes had filled with tears, the tremor in his voice. 7 years old when he started learning, 12 now. That meant he'd spent 3 years playing after she died, keeping her memory alive through every note. Richard got up and went to his home office. He opened his laptop and started writing. Not an email, not a formal proposal, just thoughts, ideas, things that needed to change. The current scholarship system favored students who already had advantages. Private teachers, expensive instruments, time to practice because their parents didn't need them working after-school jobs. What about kids like Daniel? How many other talented children were out there, dismissed because they didn't fit the traditional mold? He wrote until sunrise, filling pages with plans for a new program. Scholarships specifically for students from underprivileged backgrounds, free instrument loans, transportation assistance for kids who lived far from the academy, partnership programs with community centers in low-income neighborhoods. When he finally looked up, light was streaming through his window, and his coffee had gone cold. But he had something concrete, something that could actually make a difference. The board meeting was tense. Richard presented his ideas expecting resistance. Instead, he found something unexpected. The video had embarrassed the Academy, yes, but it had also sparked something in the board members. Several of them had received calls from alumni, from donors, from people wanting to contribute to scholarship funds specifically because of Daniel's story. The Wellington Legacy Program, Richard called it, named not after the Academy, but after the legacy that teachers like Daniel's grandmother left behind. The board approved it unanimously with one condition. Richard had to personally oversee the program and handle the first round of auditions himself. 2 weeks later, Daniel started classes at Wellington Academy. Richard made sure the boy kept his grandmother's old keyboard at home for practice. The Academy had beautiful grand pianos, state-of-the-art equipment, everything money could buy. But that keyboard was where Daniel's heart lived, where his grandmother's hands had once guided his, and Richard understood now that some things were more valuable than any instrument the Academy could provide. Vincent took Daniel under his wing, though the old teacher later admitted to Richard that he learned as much from the boy as the boy learned from him. "He plays from memory," Vincent said one afternoon, shaking his head in wonder. Not just memorizing the notes, but remembering the feeling of when his grandmother first taught him each piece. It's like she's still there guiding his hands. The other students at Wellington had mixed reactions to Daniel at first. Some were welcoming, genuinely excited to learn alongside someone with such obvious talent. Others were resentful, especially those who'd had every advantage handed to them and still couldn't play with half of Daniel's skill. There was one girl in particular, Lily, who'd been taking lessons since she was 4 years old. Her parents had spent a fortune on her education, flying in teachers from Europe, buying her a concert grand piano that cost more than most people's cars. She'd expected to be the star of her year. Then Daniel arrived. For the first week, Lily refused to speak to him. She'd practice in the smaller studios where she wouldn't have to hear him play. But one afternoon, she walked past the main hall and heard music coming from inside. She stopped, recognizing the piece immediately. It was Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, something she'd been struggling with for months. She pushed the door open quietly and watched Daniel play. He was alone, no teacher supervising, just practicing on his own. And suddenly she understood something her expensive teachers had never been able to explain. It wasn't about playing the notes correctly. It was about understanding what the composer was trying to say, what emotion they were trying to capture. When Daniel finished, he turned and saw her standing there. "Sorry, did you need the room? I can go practice somewhere else." "No," Lily said quickly. How do you do that? Make it sound so alive?" Daniel looked confused. "I don't know. I just think about what my grandmother used to say. She told me every piece of music is a story, and the pianist's job is to tell that story so clearly that people can see it in their minds. Can you show me?" The words came out before Lily could stop them. "I mean, if you have time. I've been working on that same piece and I can't get it right." Daniel smiled, a genuine warm smile. "Sure. My grandmother always said teaching someone else helps you understand the music better, too." They spent the next hour at the piano together, Lily playing while Daniel offered gentle suggestions, not technical corrections about finger positions or tempo, but questions that made her think differently. "What do you think the composer felt when he wrote this part? What story are you trying to tell?" By the end of the session, Lily was playing better than she ever had. Not perfectly, not at Daniel's level, but with more feeling and understanding than months of expensive lessons had achieved. Word spread quickly through the Academy. The scholarship kid from Queens, the one who'd humbled Director Hayes, was actually nice. More than nice. He was generous with his time and knowledge, willing to help anyone who asked. Richard watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. The Academy was changing, slowly but surely. The new scholarship program had received over 300 applications in just 2 weeks. Stories were pouring in from families who'd never dreamed their children could attend a place like Wellington. But the real test came when the Academy announced its winter showcase. Every year, select students were chosen to perform in a concert that attracted music critics, agents, and influential people from the classical music world. It was a huge opportunity, the kind that could launch a career. The selection committee met to discuss the lineup. Vincent was there along with several other senior instructors and Richard himself. When Daniel's name came up, the room went quiet. "He's only been here a month," one instructor pointed out. "The other students have been preparing all year." The boy could play in his sleep, Vincent countered. You all heard his audition. He's ready for anything. But is it fair? Another teacher asked. The other students have worked so hard. Richard had stayed silent until now, letting the teachers debate. But this was important. Fair to who, he asked. Fair to the students who've had every advantage since birth? Or fair to the boy who learned everything from a grandmother working in a factory? Who plays with more heart and soul than most professionals will achieve in their entire careers? The room was quiet. If we're serious about this new program, Richard continued, if we really want Wellington to be about merit and talent instead of just money and connections, then we need to show it. Daniel earned his place here. He's earned the right to perform. The vote was unanimous. Daniel would open the winter showcase with Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece he'd played at his audition. When Richard told him the news, Daniel's reaction was unexpected. The boy went pale, his hands starting to shake. In front of everyone? Real critics and important people? The same piece you played for me, Richard assured him. You've done it before. You can do it again. But Daniel shook his head, fear clear in his eyes. That was different. That was just for my grandmother. This is real. Richard knelt down, remembering another time he'd been on his knees in front of this boy. Daniel, every time you play is real. Every time you sit at that piano, your grandmother is listening. Whether it's in an audition room or on a concert stage, it's the same music, the same story you're telling. Don't play for the critics or the important people. Play for her. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. Okay, I'll try. You'll do more than try, Richard said gently. You'll remind everyone in that concert hall why music matters in the first place. The night of the winter showcase arrived cold and clear. Outside the concert hall, expensive cars lined up to drop off elegantly dressed patrons. Inside, the lobby buzzed with conversation as critics, music agents, and wealthy donors mingled before the performance. Backstage, Daniel sat alone in a small dressing room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He wore a suit that the Academy had provided, tailored to fit his small frame. It was the nicest thing he'd ever worn, but it felt strange, like he was pretending to be someone else. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his legs, trying to make them stop, but it didn't work. In 2 hours, he'd be walking onto that stage in front of hundreds of people. Real musicians would be judging him. Professional critics would be writing reviews. A soft knock at the door made him jump. It's me, his mother's voice came through. Can I come in? Yeah, she entered carrying something wrapped in cloth. Her dress was simple but clean, borrowed from a friend for the occasion. She looked nervous, too, out of place in this world of wealth and sophistication, but her eyes were warm as she sat down next to him. I brought you something, she said, unwrapping the cloth to reveal an old photograph in a simple frame. Daniel's breath caught. It was his grandmother, much younger, sitting at a piano. He'd never seen this picture before. This was taken in Shanghai before she left China, his mother explained. She was performing at a concert hall just like you're about to do. She was only 19. Daniel took the frame with trembling hands, studying the photograph closely. His grandmother looked so young, so full of hope and dreams. He could see the concentration on her face, the way her hands were positioned on the keys. The same way she'd taught him to hold his own hands. She had to give up performing when we came to America, his mother continued. The language barrier, the need to work, to survive. But she never gave up the music. And when you were born, when she started teaching you, it was like watching her dreams come alive again through you. I'm scared, Mom, Daniel whispered. What if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough?